We want to talk about living strong in times of trouble. The original title was What to Do When the Bad Guys Win. But I was afraid that would discourage some of you. So we tried to make it a little more generic, but it's probably going to go back down with what to do when the bad guys win. 3 times in this chapter, verses 1 and verse 7 and verse 8, if I remember correctly, we are told not to fret. We are also told in other verses, they changed the word from fret to anger. Don't get angry. And I thought it was interesting. The Hebrew word translated anger comes from the root word for nostril. And that seems strange, but you know how it is when somebody's really mad. You notice how their nostrils kind of flare out like big enough to encase a cantaloupe, you know. They're trying to hold it, but their nostrils flare. And the writer says, don't do that. Don't let yourself get exasperated. Don't let yourself get worked up in anger because this is a dangerous, dangerous place to go. Now, I want you to think with me for just a moment to put this in situation and in perspective. You say, Pastor, why are you preaching a message that's about just getting mad? You know, don't get mad. Well, you know, what did my wife call you this week? You know, did my mom and dad call you? What's going on? Why are you talking about anger? Because what we find in Psalm 37 is the advice given to David. We don't have any idea of what event it is connected to. Other scholars say it's connected to some event. We don't know which one. Other scholars say, well, no, it's not really about an event. It's about life. David has lived this, and he's telling the people of God, if you want to walk in blessing, if we can use it today, if you want to host his presence, don't allow yourself to cave in to fearing and fretting because it always leads to disaster. Now, we don't have to look far in David's life to find an illustration of this. We go to a passage when David was on the run. And guys, I want to tell you, to be on the run for about 10 years from somebody that has tried repeatedly to take your life, that's a tough thing. Those that are going to Israel in a couple of weeks, we'll go to a place called En-Gedi or En-Gedi, and you'll see those caves where David hid. You'll see the fountain, or the stream rather, a waterfall actually, of where David drank water, where Saul and his men drank water. And it creates this atmosphere where you understand that all these years ago, Saul was there refreshing his army in a hunt for David, not knowing that David was hiding in one of those caves overlooking that waterfall, the only one in the area. And he's tired. He's tired from this running. Now, I'm not talking about En-Gedi, but I'm talking about David running. He's tired. He had an expectation. It was a perfectly logical expectation. All through the season of the fattening of the sheep, his men had served as a guard around the flocks of Nabal. Now, we don't work that way, but it was customary in the land. The workers of Nabal, the owners of the sheep, would say, these men were a wall of protection to us. David's men made us feel safe and secure. They never touched anything that didn't belong to them. They always treated us with respect. We were never afraid when they came by. That was the way it worked in that part of the land. And the custom was, when you provided safety and security, at shearing time, you came and asked for a portion. Wasn't a lot, wasn't a huge amount, but it was the owner's way of saying thank you for keeping us safe. So David sent his men down into the shearing camp of Nabal. And David, with great humility, through his men, says, we've come for whatever you think would be acceptable. We've come to celebrate your harvest, and we've tried to do our best to protect you, to care for you, and to make sure that no body stole your sheep and no animal stole your sheep. and we're here for whatever you would see as right. And Nabal says, I've heard about David running from his master. Why in the world should he think I owe him anything? And he dishonored David's messengers and broke the custom of the land and sent them on their way shamefaced and broken. And when they get to David, they tell him what happens. Now you've got to understand, David's been praising God. David's been singing hymns. David's been going from victory to victory. David's been writing psalms. And all of a sudden, something snaps. When they say, he said, David, who is David? And you can see David going from the pious saint songwriter to, who is David? Who is David? So he designates several hundred of his men. Get your swords, mount up. I'm going to go explain who David is. And he's about to go to Nabal and remove 15 pounds of ugly fat. And he is so angry. And Nabal is a fool. That's what his name means, is fool. The workers for Nabal make an appeal to Abigail. They say, this is wrong. This is a disaster. We're all going to die because boss man's a fool. And you're married to him. So do something. And David is exactly as Psalm 37 describes. He's fretting, because fret means to burn. Fret means to burn with anger and frustration. I didn't know how powerful a word fret was, because when I was growing up, whenever you rocked a baby and the baby would not be satisfied, you'd always say, don't fret, don't fret, don't fret, little one. See, I always thought fretting was a little baby whimper. But fretting is an explosion of anger, of desire for revenge, a desire to take things into your own hands. And David is fretting. David's going to kill him. Abigail says, man, we are in over our heads. This is what I want you to do. Get food ready. Get this ready. Get that ready. She knew she only had a limited amount of time. And when David and his men come over the hill, they find Abigail in a kneeling position with all of these gifts. And David calls everything to a halt as he sees this woman. And she begins her speech this way. David, as my husband's name is, so is he. He's a fool. And I know what has happened. And I know that my husband has done wrong. David went from a situation, she said, I understand this, David. You've gone from a situation of being anointed, the Lord's chosen. You've got promises you're holding to. It's just a matter of time before you're king. I understand everything that God has promised in your life. But David, I also understand this, and this is something that angry men don't remember. If you act in anger, justified though it may be, you'll win and you will prevail, and you'll not only get the portion of the spoil or the produce that belongs to you, but you'll get everything. David, this is a win-win for you, and your anger is justified, except for one thing. David, the day will come. It might be in a month, it might be in a year, but we all know that God has promised you will be the next king. But when that day comes and God's ready to make you king, David, you're going to have blood on your hands. David, you're going to have acted in the flesh in such a way that it may slow down what God wants to do. And David, God forbid, but it may actually hinder what God wants to do. And you know what David said? He called his men off and he blessed Abigail. He said, you've kept me from making the biggest mistake in my life. And David and his men went away being willing to be done wrong, understanding that his speech he rehearsed doesn't have to be delivered. He understands that the just anger that he felt does not need to be expressed. And what we find out is that Nabal was going to be dead he's going to be dead in less than 2 weeks anyway. He would die from a stroke. And David began to realize, in my anger, I was on my way to kill a dead man walking. And loved ones, I want to tell you, so many times if the devil can get us to fall prey to these mind games. See, a couple of weeks ago and even last week we talked about unforgiveness. If the devil can get us wrapped up in unforgiveness, it doesn't mean that we don't have a legitimate complaint. Doesn't mean we haven't been dealt wrong, but we handle it wrong, and it hinders everything God wants to do. He tells us to forgive so that our Father in heaven will forgive us. And loved ones, I want to tell you, there is not a doctrine in the book, there's not a doctrine in Scripture that says if you don't forgive somebody, God won't forgive you. You don't go to heaven because of your wonderful ability to forgive. But when it says, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who have sinned against us, it's very clear when you take all the teaching about Scripture, what it means simply is this. When we don't forgive, it hinders everything that God is doing by the work of forgiveness in your life. There's no teaching that says, if Justin hurts my feelings and I can't get over it, I'm going to hell. But there is a teaching, there's more than one teaching, that says everything in my life is going to be hindered because I won't forgive Justin. God slows your whole process down. And so we learned last week, let go of unforgiveness. But I want to tell you something else that's just as deadly as unforgiveness. It's the idea of being in fretting and fear. The idea that I've had it, I'm not going to take any more. I've got to do something. I'm going to deal with this sin that has been visited upon my life. And you and I begin to rage with anger, and we call it righteous indignation, and we're on our way to set the world right. And the best thing that can happen to you is an Abigail that will stop you and say, I understand what you're feeling. I know you've been done wrong. But please understand, all of us know the promise God has made to you. All of us understand the promise of hosting His presence. But understand this, if you deal with this yourself, great tragedy is going to come. There's going to be blood on your hands. When my kids used to fight, and nothing breaks my heart more than my kids to not be at peace with each other. Always. Always has, always will. Nothing breaks my heart like that. But when one of my children did another one wrong, we just kind of had a way of dealing with it. I would let them give me their case. I'd let them give me their perspective on it. And I'd say, look, we can handle this one of two ways. You can let me handle it, or you can try to handle it yourself. And there were a couple of times they said, all right, I'll handle it. And it never worked. Never worked. Never worked. Let me say this, never came close to working. So my kids, who are good kids and wise kids, began to understand, I'm mad, I'm so mad. I remember one of my precious little girls talking to me saying, Daddy, I want you to handle it. She's rubbing her knuckles. She's already been trying to deal with it herself. Getting a hold of her brother, he's got busted knuckles. And okay, Daddy, you can handle it. And we need to learn to do that with Father. Now, I'm going to do something that I don't usually do. I'm not going to read Psalm 37 today, except just a couple of verses. But I'll put it all in your notes because it is the chapter about not fretting and not fearing. You say, Pastor, why is this so important? Because I thought whenever God said that He is preparing us to host His presence, I thought He was preparing a house. But I've come to believe that He's preparing hearts. See, I thought He was preparing a place, but I've come to see He's preparing people. And this is why God seems to be just taking us to school over attitudes and dispositions and emotions. And we're not going to talk about the house, I don't think, until we've got the heart straight. And I want you to understand, especially as persecution ramps up, especially as times get more and more difficult, you and I must learn. We must learn to not allow fretting and fear to drive our emotions and to drive our hearts. We've got to understand that just as God deals with unforgiveness in us, He deals with fretting and fear. Now, let's just look at a couple of verses. Verse 1, do not fret because of those who are evil, or be envious of those who do wrong. Why? For like the grass, they will soon wither. Like green plants, they will soon die away. Well, what do I do when things aren't right? Verse 3, trust in the Lord, do good, dwell in the land, enjoy safe pasture, take delight in the Lord. He'll give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will do this. He will make your righteous reward shine like the dawn, your vindication like the noonday sun. And then there's verse 6b that occurs in the Chitty translation. It says, but Lord, I'm surrounded by idiots who need their butts whipped, and I'm going to help you do it. But then you go to verse 7. Be still before the Lord. Wait patiently for Him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret. It only leads to evil. He says if you cave in to fret, you may be doing the right thing. You may be fighting the right enemies, but it'll always backfire on you. Always, always. And then we could read so much more. The chapter's a good one, and it's a long one. And he reminds us in verse 39, the salvation of the righteous comes from the Lord. He is their stronghold in time of trouble. The Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from wicked and saves them because they take refuge in Him. Now, loved, I want you to understand a couple of things with me today. It is a sense of helplessness, Roman numeral 1, that is the mother of fear and fretting. David Wilkerson called these two things, fearing and fretting, the devil's twins. He says these are twins from the devil that always appear arm in arm, side by side. You never find one without the other one being close by. Fear and fretting. Now, fear produces dread, insecurity, a heavy oppression. Worst of all, it produces a double-mindedness. You know, the Bible tells us not to be double-minded. That word is actually two-souled. In other words, he says what fear produces is a split personality where you instinctively want to trust the Lord, but at the same time you want to take matters into your own hands. Fretting means, according to the Hebrew scholars, to boil with anger, to seek to take matters into your own hand with the intent of resolving evil. David and Nabal was an example of this. Peter in the garden deciding he's going to solve all of Jesus' troubles with a sword is the same manifestation. And it was even my favorite apostle, John. John saw people weren't responding. It was a bad Sunday morning in Galilee. I mean, it was a bad Sunday morning. John looked around and he said, Jesus, would you like for us to call down fire on these people? I mean, how many pastors have ever said that on a bad Sunday? How many congregations have listened to a bad sermon and said, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven? And you know what Jesus said? He says, you don't understand the spirit that you're made of. He says, we've not come to destroy, we've come to redeem. That's why he laid down a ground rule that said, vengeance is mine and I will repay, says the Lord. Now, what does this thing look like in our lives? Well, you may be going along just like David with promises on your life, with prophecies on your life, with blessing on your life, and you, by every calculation in the book, say it's time to receive, it's time to be blessed, and all of a sudden things go backwards. And it's very easy because we're living in a society that is losing its civility. You say, oh, well, we're still better than the rest of the world. I think we're better than most of the world. But you've got to understand, Americans for years, by and large, and I know there are horrendous exceptions to this, but by and large, Americans have been a peaceful nation. And they are governed by laws of civility. But we're losing any sense of civility. I hate social media. I despise the internet. I really do, because somehow it has emboldened people to say things they would never have the courage to say face to face. It has emboldened people to start fights that they would never fight, never start in another setting. And I want to tell you what, I know you guys are saying, you're just an old guy. Well, I want to tell you something. I am. Now, let me go on and say this. I realize that I am behind the times, but I'm not so old that I don't understand that things that have good sides also have bad sides to them. And for every good thing I can say about social media, I can point out about 15 bad things. And what we're finding is a loss of civility. And so what happens is we have things like road rage. We have things like news rage. People watch so much news that they want to they want to do more than they'll do. But we have entered a time now where if you do not agree with someone, whether you're black, white, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. If you don't agree with someone, the only way you are dealt with is that you are a racist, you are a hater, you are an idiot, you need to be locked up, you need to be killed. There's no social discourse anymore, and our politicians, generally speaking, lead the way with that. And it makes us furious, the news rage, the road rage, the loss of civility. And then on top of that, we see broken justice. I remember back when I was a kid about a black man that wanted to vote in Mississippi. And he had the right to vote. That had been guaranteed to him for generations. But when he tried to vote, they told him he couldn't vote. He came back with more paperwork and tried to vote. And what they did is they took 2 bags of chicken feed, threw it in the back seat of his car. When he couldn't produce a receipt for paying for the chicken feed, he was charged with a felony count of grand theft and spent 7 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Now, loved ones, I want to tell you that causes rage. That causes anger. He went to jail for 7 years for a misdemeanor that he wasn't even guilty of. Every time a child is abused, every time a woman is raped, the list goes on and on. We get more and more angry. Every time a church compromises its message, and every time, and we're seeing more and more of this, politicians who say, yes, I'm a Christian, here's my Jesus, but over here's my politics. And you never know if they're going to operate from their party line or they're going to operate from their Christian line. Do you realize that if Christians in America would simply vote biblical standards and convictions, abortion would be off the docket? I'm not talking about all that we'd have to go through. I'm saying, let's just drop Christians, just say even Roman Catholic Christians. If Roman Catholics voted what their church said about abortion, abortion would be resolved in a peaceful way. And if Christians would do that, but no, we're in an age where we say, I love Jesus, this is my Jesus, but I'm going to embrace whatever politics I want because my politics are not the same as my religion. And that means neither your religion or your politics are valid. Now I want you to know, I'm not trying to make you go into a rage. I'm just trying to say these are the kind of things that make us rage. There are things that we want to take into our hands and fix them. Now, how does this fear and fretting work against us? What are the lock pickers that Satan uses to mess with our peace. See, because in Philippians 4:7, it says the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will stand guard over our hearts and lives. And if the peace of God, which passes all understanding, is standing guard, the word's phulake, it means a guard is standing sentry over our peace. But what happens? Who's picking the lock that gets through our peace and begins to cause this sense of fretting in our lives? Number one, a feeling of helplessness. This is Roman numeral 2 on your outline. A feeling of helplessness occurs when evil is rampant. I want to tell you, when evil is rampant, it gives us a feeling of helplessness. Do you know, and we call it, the New Testament calls it a spirit of lawlessness. It's one of the signs of living in the last days. A spirit of lawlessness. A spirit of lawlessness. And do you know what Jesus said? I don't know the last time I've heard this preached, except just maybe mentioned here and there. But Jesus said this, because evil abounds, the love of many will grow cold. Do you understand that the more you and I live in a lawless society, the tendency is that our love grows cold and our anger grows hot. Our love grows cold and our anger grows hot. And that's why Antichrist is called, among other things, the man of lawlessness. And just as the New Testament says, there are 3 ways that Antichrist manifests himself. There are 3 ways that lawlessness manifests itself. First of all, there is a spirit of Antichrist that just permeates the atmosphere. The same thing is true of lawlessness. There is a spirit of lawlessness that permeates the atmosphere. You say, Pastor, I feel it. And do you realize that we're living in one of the most law-abiding nations on the earth? Do you understand what this is like worldwide? But not only is there a spirit of Antichrist and a spirit of lawlessness, there are false teachers of Antichrist, representatives of Antichrist. And guys, I want to tell you, the world is full of people that are convinced the way we solve our economic problems, the way we solve our political problems, the way we solve our social problems, the way we bring justice to its fruition is through lawlessness. Break the system down. Break peace down. Hurt those that may not have anything to do with the problem because they brought it on themselves. No, it's lawlessness. And then there will be the Antichrist himself. And there will be dominions of lawlessness itself. It may be coming through governments, through authorities, through institutions, through street gangs. I don't know. Look at what's going on in India right now. India for decades has turned the other cheek, so to speak, to sexual crime against women. And you may remember a couple of years ago, a woman was raped on a bus as it was going from stop to stop, gang raped by several men. And the nation of India said, we're not going to have this. We're going to take care of our ladies. And not too long ago, a lady was raped by, I think it was like 7 or 14, I forget the number of men. The parents went to the law and said, we want justice for our daughters. So they took the rapist and they fined them $750 and told them to do 100 sit-ups. And the parents said, this is not justice. And they said, this is all we're going to do. And the bottom line is that the rapists come to the house, beat the mother and father, and burn the 16-year-old girl alive. That's lawlessness. And not only is it lawlessness, but that makes our love grow cold. And you just want to say, where's Harry? Where's Dirty Harry? Where's Clint Eastwood? Who can we hire to shoot these people in the head? And I'm telling you, it's something that is demonically inspired. So a feeling of helplessness occurs when evil is rampant. Letter B, a feeling of helplessness occurs when evil is not punished adequately or properly. The book of Ecclesiastes says when judgment against a sin or a crime is not carried out expeditiously, the hearts of the people doubt justice will occur. I remember looking up a name on the internet a couple of years ago. I found him and I saw his obituary. I saw that a biography of his life, what he had done, and there was just a one sentence mention that he had a little trouble and went to jail for 2 years, but he got out and became a businessman, and it talked about all of his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren, and just a wonderful guy according to all accounts. And I sat there and began to realize that this rage was building in me because this man that had this wonderful life, except for just a couple of years in jail, murdered my uncle, stabbed him to death at a bar in Houston. And because of I'm a little biased when I say this, but because of my uncle being nobody, because of it being at a bar, because the city of Houston has this kind of thing going all the time, the judge told my family, we have bigger fish to fry. We can't deal with everything you want us to deal with. So they gave the man 2 years for second-degree murder. And I thought about my uncle that never saw his 40th birthday. I thought about his daughter that was raised as an orphan. I thought about all kinds of things, and I kept getting more and more angry. And I want to tell you, when we see evil not being punished adequately or properly, it causes us to go through phases. See, justice is in our DNA, and when justice isn't carried out, we go through at least 5 phases of that. Number 1, we're shocked. When justice isn't done, we're shocked. Number 2, when justice isn't done after we're shocked, we grieve. And then after we grieve, we get angry. Number 4, if we don't deal with it, we take matters into our own hands. And number 5, we allow hatred into our own hearts. Guys, I want to tell you, this thing called fretting and fear is very real. And when we begin to face persecution, when we begin to become the object of unfair laws, which is already happening in our country, we're going to have a whole new batch of things to deal with in our lives. Number 3, a feeling of helplessness occurs when we forget that God is trustworthy. Now, we all know that, and we all say that. But the fact of the matter is, because God's ways are higher than our ways. And you know what that means, that passage that we love in Isaiah? For as the heavens are higher than the earth, my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. See, we have a tendency to think like the Greeks and Romans did, that they thought the gods were just superior humans or humans endued with power. Therefore, to understand the gods in the Roman or Greek culture, all you had to do is think of the best that a person ought to be, and you understand the God. But I want to tell you, God's not just a souped-up man. His ways are different than our ways. They're not the improved version of our ways. They are different than our ways. God is altogether different than us. Now, there are some connection points He gives. He helps us understand His love by explaining He's a Father. I mean, there are some great connection points, but God is not a superior human that needs to be understood. And when we think that, we invariably end up getting mad with Him for not moving fast enough, or not doing the right thing, or not doing it the way it ought to be done. But God says, hey, everything's right on schedule. And then I say, not my schedule. Everything is being handled exactly as it should be. Not in my world, not in my universe. And we begin to get that feeling of fretting. Number 3, we said that we get that way when we forget that God is trustworthy. And number 4, a feeling of helplessness occurs when we do not know how to respond to evil. When we don't know how to respond to evil. We want to take matters into our own hand. We want to kill the Nabals of life. We want to call down fire from heaven. I want to tell you something. I was watching a news commentary the other day, and I'm ashamed. I am ashamed. I'm not proud of this at all, and I'm not advising that you do it. But somebody made a comment, and I listened, and I listened, and I listened. One of my kids says, "What do you think, Dad?" I said one word. I said, "Jackass." You say, "Oh, but you didn't mean it." "Oh, yeah, I meant worse." Made up my mind and said, "I'll never say that again." So I went into staff the next day. The same thing came up. Jackass. And I want to tell you guys, I'm not proud of that. I'm not trying to be a shock preacher. I'm just saying that was how I felt. When I went to my devotion later, God began to deal with me, and I knew I shouldn't have said that. I knew it very well, because in my early days I got whippings for that. But the Lord helped me understand. He said, "I died for that person." And I said, jokingly, I said, "Yeah, but did you know what they were going to be saying?" I mean, and the Lord wasn't in a joking mood. And He spoke to me in gentleness and kindness. He said, "Son, don't call anyone that. Don't call anyone that. Remember, I told you not to call someone a fool. I told you in the Scriptures not to call anyone empty-headed." This is the same thing. And I repented thoroughly. We don't know how to respond to evil, and we have to understand what Jesus meant when He says, you don't know the spirit that you need to operate by. Can I tell you one more thing? You may not say jackass, but I've known a lot of Christians that celebrate when bad things happen to our, quote, enemies. And I want to tell you, you need to be careful. I need to be careful that we don't celebrate things that we have no business celebrating. We need to be careful with that. Now, what do we do, Pastor? How do we wrap this up? Well, let me give you some guidelines for confronting evil. Number one, just state your case before the Lord. There's nothing wrong with having a case to make before the Lord. Hannah did it. Esther did it. Abigail did before David. Remember the widow who made her appeal before the uncaring judge? She just kept bothering the judge, and finally the judge said, I don't care for God, I don't care about people, but this woman's bugging me. And we have so messed up that verse. We think that verse means just bug God, just keep bugging God, and He'll finally do it. But there are parables of comparison and there are parables of contrast. That parable is not saying just bug God, just keep bugging Him. No, it's a parable of contrast. He says, if she was able to turn the heart of a man that doesn't care, how much more so will your prayers touch the heart of a God who does care? See, he was saying this lady fought and finally got the bad judge to turn. But you have a fair judge. You have a righteous judge. Pour your heart out to Him, because God is not a God whose reluctance must be overcome. God is a God whose willingness must be embraced. Number two, remember that prayer that prevails in heaven begins in heaven. In other words, let God give you His perspective. That's why Jesus had 100% answered prayer. He said, I only act upon what Father tells me to act upon. This is the confidence we have in Him, that if we ask anything according to His will, we know that He hears us. And if we know that He hears us, then we know we have the petition that we desired. And again, you don't build doctrine from a verse, you build it from all the verses. But when you put it all together, it simply comes to a teaching about prayer that says this: whatever the Father puts in your heart, latch on to that. Pray that. That's His will, and we'll receive what we want. Number three, while waiting for God to move, choose the path of opposite behavior. I tell people regularly who want to get involved in spiritual warfare, they want to bring down principalities and powers, they want to pray against things. I said, you must start with the most effective, powerful spiritual warfare there is, and that is opposite behavior. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Jesus says, love those that hate you. Serve those that hurt you. Speak well of those who speak ill of you. Pray for those who set out to destroy you. Turn your curses into blessings. His strength is made perfect in your weakness, and they will know you are my disciples because of the great love that you show. Loved ones, I've got to wrap this up. It's almost time for us to go. But I'm telling you that I believe there are people here today. You love God with all of your heart. You love God with all of your heart. You want God's will to be done with all of your heart. You're tired of seeing society ripped apart. You're tired of having just people that seem to be moral idiots winning the day. But can I tell you this? The victory is won, and we host the presence of God by refusing to fear and refusing to fret. You say, Pastor, that's really hard to treat people the way they ought to be treated instead of the way they deserve to be treated. It's not hard. It's impossible. And that's why it takes heaven. But it can be done because you see Jesus. No one ever mistreated as much as Jesus. Says, Father, lay not this sin to their charge. The Greek word was aphete. What he says is, Lord, just keep dealing with them till they see the truth. That's literally what he was saying. He wasn't saying, Lord, write this off. Oh, don't pay any attention to this. They're just killing God. Don't pay any attention to it. No, he's saying, Father, don't let judgment come right now. Effete. Deal with them till they come to understand what they're doing. Give them time. You see Stephen treated horrendously in an evil fashion, but he understood. He understood what fearing and fretting does. So what does he do? He says, Father, don't lay this sin to their charge. He knew that wrath and anger doesn't win the day. It distorts us. It makes us hard men. And I want to tell you, loved ones, I don't like being called a sissy. But maybe you could say, Pastor, you're an Abigail for me. This message, you're an Abigail for me. And I just want to ask you, because in fact, I want to just go ahead and ask you to stand right now as I close this message. Let me ask you this. You're not going to have to come and speak it into a microphone. You don't have to tell anybody. Again, I'm talking to people that love God with all of their heart. But what act are you contemplating? What act do you wish you could perform to get your vengeance? What attitude has found a home in your heart that you may never do anything, but you have an attitude that's a curse toward other people, a curse toward politicians, a curse toward leaderships, a curse toward whatever it is? What act have you embraced, or what attitude has somehow found a home in your heart? What argument do you rehearse? One day I'm going to tell that person what I think. One day I'm going to get this bill paid and I'm going to march down there and I'm going to spit over everybody. And if they try to arrest me, I'll just let them hold me. But the whole time I'm going to be gathering more spit. I'm going to just... Loved ones, are you fretting? Are you boiling? The quiet of the night, are your nostrils flaring? Have you created ways to bring vengeance upon a situation? Let me tell you what, God says, I'm going to inhabit this house in a phenomenal way. God says, I'm going to release gifts of healing and gifts of the Spirit, miraculous. There's going to be a glory cloud that comes and changes the lives of your children forever. There's going to be such a move of God in this place that what else is on the clock won't matter. Would you listen to an Abigail that says, don't get blood on your hands? Don't get blood on your hands. Are you willing to be done wrong in order for God to do right? That's why the apostle said, I understand that the suffering of this present life, he used the word reckon. It's an old math word. I reckon that the sufferings of this present life are not worthy to be revealed to the glory that will be revealed within us. Do you understand there's a direct correlation? Suffer, glory. Suffer, glory. Or you can handle it. And you can sit on the outside and rub your knuckles after the confrontation. I took care of it. Lord, don't worry. I cleared the path for you. Or you can say, Lord, I'm not going to get involved in fretting and fearing. Okay, we've got to go. My time's up. If you are here today and your desire, you don't have to confess to anybody, and nobody will assign guilt for anything to you by coming. But here's another opportunity for us to get ready to host the presence. If you feel your life has been unfairly treated, there's hurt, there's bitterness, there's unfairness, there's a lack of justice. Pastor, I know it may be with the police, it may be with other authority, maybe people of another race. It could be a company that has more lawyers than you can afford. I understand. But are you willing to let it go so that God can make room for you to hold blessing? You say, Pastor, that stinks. I know, that's why it's so hard. That's why we have altar calls. I know. But I want to tell you, there are things that if I let it, it would keep me awake at night. There are things that keep trying to come back. But I want to tell you, I want to clear out everything. I want to clear out everything so I can host His presence. And I want to join you. I'm going to join you. I'm going to pray for you after you come. If you want to let go of stuff, come on. Just join me in the altar, would you? Just join me in the altar.